The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Welcome to this one-off session of the Women and Equalities Committee on Incel Culture and Ideology. Can I welcome you all? Thank you very much for coming along. Can I ask you all to introduce yourselves and please let us know if you're happy to be addressed by your first name. If I can start with you.
So I'm Dr. Andrew Thomas. I'm a senior lecturer of psychology at Swansea University, and yes, feel free to call me Andrew.
I'm Joe Whittaker. I am also a senior lecturer in Criminology, Sociology and Social Policy, and I'd much rather Joe as well, please.
Thank you.
My name is William Costello. I'm a doctoral researcher from the University of Texas at Austin, and happy for you to call me William.
Thank you all very much. So this question is addressed to all of you, but Andrew, if I can ask you to answer first. Can you tell us by what we mean by incel? Is there an agreed and a useful kind of working definition of this term?
Well, there's agreement in terms of the term, which is voluntarily celibate, but there's two things going on. You have it as a definition of sort of relationship status or absence of relationship status. So in that sense, it means someone who isn't having sex, and they feel like that is not something under their control. It's involuntary. Separate to that, you have the incel community. So you have a group of men who've built an identity around that label, and that's something that's quite different. It's not uncommon to have individuals who will identify with the label describing their relationship status, but not be part of any community, go on any forums or anything like that. So it's very much tied to that sexlessness.
Thank you, Joe.
Very little to add above that, apart from I think really trying to understand what incels are particularly well known for, which is when you go online, some extraordinarily toxic posting. That's why, to be quite frank, it is kind of very newsworthy. It's why, for a lot of the reasons we talk about it, is you only need to log on to one of these forums for about 5 minutes and see extreme hostile misogyny and it being very commonplace.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on to that is that some of that aggressive misogyny, in rarer instances still, sometimes that turns into violent rage, and we have some high-profile examples of incel killings, which are cause of great concern.
Thank you. If I stay with you for a minute, William, has the definition changed at all over time?
Yes, actually. So the original incel community was actually set up by a lesbian woman in the late 1990s, and it was a pretty benign kind of support group for people who were involuntarily single. Now the community has descended into toxicity since then and no longer resembles that original inception, and it's kind of now a misogynistic online subculture that we know.
Thank you. Please.
No, I've got nothing to add to that.
Okay. And is it, Andrew, I'll come back to you, is it an exclusively male culture?
So it depends on who you ask. If you ask incels themselves, then they will say yes. Their argument will be that women compared to men find it much easier to gain sexual access, and so the voices of incels would say that if a woman is sexless, then that is really through their choice or maybe through their pickiness. Whereas they see their plight, if you will, is even though they would like to have sex, they would like to have relationships, they're not being chosen for that, and the hopelessness that comes with the incel community is that they feel there's very little that they could do to change that. Separately, though, that's from the voices from within the incel community. You do have smaller communities of women who would describe themselves as femcel. A greater growing change is this concept of insings, so involuntarily single, and that seems to apply more to women in the sense that they feel competent to gain access to sex, but they feel like they find it very difficult to set up meaningful romantic relationships and find long-term commitment from others.
And how many people identify as incel in the UK? Do you know?
It's very hard to pin down that number. What we know is the way that we can kind of we can't answer that precisely. What we do know is that we have online communities and forums, and you can see the membership of those. We have also subreddits, and those tend to have numbers in the tens of thousands. But for every person you have on those forums, there will be other individuals who are maybe not joining a forum, maybe they are digesting the content quite separately and not signing up to an account. If you're talking about young men who feel excluded from relationships, then that number could easily be in 7 figures worldwide.
To add to that, we actually conducted some cross-cultural research on singlehood more broadly, and in that data, which I think was roughly 7,000 participants from 14 different countries, and 13% of people in that data set identified as involuntarily single. But the incel subculture, I think right now there's roughly 20,000 active users in the main forum, the main online forum, incels.is. So that's kind of, it oscillates between 20,000 to maybe 100,000 at any given time. And that's our best estimate.
And that's just one forum. Mm-hmm. So as we cover in the report, there's lots of different ways that incels network. Pseudonymous and anonymous forums are one of them, but there are other methods as well that don't lend itself to recording number.
And just to add that our research demonstrates, like almost every other human being, that incels are using multiple platforms at the same time as well. So just to add to that complexity of trying to pin down an exact number, it is in the tens of thousands, but they could be on multiple forums, could be on multiple subreddits, etc., etc.
And just one more final point. It's important to acknowledge that other research has found that the vast majority of incel content that's produced in the forums is produced by just roughly 10% of the accounts. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't tacit agreement from people who don't post in the forums, but like with any community, the most extreme content is produced by a fringe minority within the community.
That's one of the reasons why we have tried to go for primary research data and actually reach out to incels to study them, because a lot of the research in the area tends to be secondary data analysis, so scraping information from forums. And as Will said, if we have a small proportion of people who are generating the content, then that research is going to be giving a potentially biased view of what incels as a population believe.
Okay, thank you. And Joe, I'll ask you this one. What does incel ideology have in common with the ideology of other groups occupying the manosphere? For example, pick-up artists or self-proclaimed misogynists? Yes. I'm not going to name one. But
no, thank you. I appreciate it. Although there's parliamentary privilege, though, I guess. But yeah. So there's clearly... The manosphere is an interesting kind of way of thinking about this, because what you have is a lot of groups that clearly have some kind of misogynistic attitude, sometimes verging on the violent, and it also includes people that kind of come to it from a range of different kind of political viewpoints. But what you can clearly see within the manosphere is sections of the far right, and clear kind of agreement with what I think anyone would describe as far right ideology, and that is also occupies the same space as incels. Now, perhaps the easiest way of differentiating the two is the way that incels themselves like to do it, and in fact these members of the far right, is by thinking about the red pill and the black pill. The red pill comes from the film The Matrix, 1997? 99, sorry. In which, the idea is if you take the red pill, you kind of understand the truth of the world and your eyes are open to you. And really, it's a kind of a cornerstone of the ideology of both, is that there is something of a mating crisis that is caused, probably fair to say it was being caused by the kind of growth of feminism in the second half of the last century, led to a lot of sexual freedom for women, and that caused this kind of mating crisis for men. So that is a general point of agreement for both the red pill and the black pill. Where incels differ, where the black pill starts to begin, is this kind of understanding of hopelessness. There is no real opportunity for them to change. If you are an incel, you're kind of at the lowest rung of the sexual marketplace, as it were, or the dating marketplace, and you should kind of basically give up and just go from there.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I normally like to describe this is red pill tends to have an element of agency and realizing how the world is. You now need to try to change yourself, change your behaviour. Whereas the black pill is more about giving up. So they have one trope which is hope, cope or rope. So the only way that you will continue in your present condition, the pathway for you is either you stay hopeful that something might change, or you find a way to cope with your tragedy, or you take the ultimate way out. So it's a very bleak hopelessness perspective from the incel community that you don't find in the wider manosphere.
Yeah, and then just to add to that, in terms of attempts to radicalize each other or radicalize others, that would be how that would manifest. They encourage others to accept the black pill and swallow the black pill and accept that particularly bleak truth as they see it. So that's the way the kind of radicalization attempts happen within the incel community.
And how much crossover is there between the two? Is there a kind of half red, half black?
I think you would see a direction of travel where people might initially embrace the red pill and then descend into the black pill. So there is some data to show that there's a direct pipeline of the users of pickup artist forums directly to incel forums. And the way I could maybe think about that working is, if you're a young man who's struggling to learn about the dating market, you might turn to pickup artists and you might attempt some of the crude tactics that they describe, and you might find that they don't work. And if they don't work, you may reach the conclusion, I've tried the blueprint manual, it didn't work, I must be incel. And this is particularly pointed when you think about the high levels of autism spectrum disorder among incels. They're very black and white in their thinking, and the black pill analysis of the dating market fits very much with black and white rigid thinking. It's very static, and we also see very poor mental health in incels more broadly. And when an individual is in poor mental health, they switch from analysing the complexity of the world to a very black and white, easier to explain analysis of complex issues.
If it's okay, just to supplement that, there's been research which has looked at that kind of broader manosphere over time, and just a kind of a linguistic analysis looking at the kind of toxicity and the sentiments and things like that, and has generally found that it's got more toxic and more negative over time, as well as that movement sort of towards incel stuff is more toxic than it was 10, 15 years ago in the world of pickup artists and things like that.
Also, some research did compare the extreme language of those different groups, and I believe incels were actually second last, kind of counterintuitively, compared to other men going their own way, pickup artist groups, in terms of the misogynistic content, which is surprising.
Yeah.
I was just going to say there's a dearth of primary research, full stop, on the incel community, and really the next step is to do something longitudinal so we can actually see how the path to inceldom works. So we believe that it starts in this very sort of red pill place and becomes more black pill, and maybe becomes more focused over time inwards and then outwards towards others. That's what the cross-sectional data seems to show us. But we're lacking that good causal evidence, which is what our research program is trying to do next.
I also think future research should maybe focus on incel exit forums. So incel exit forums consist of individuals who are no longer see themselves as incel and have exited that worldview. So that could be very informative to do some primary research with individuals who identify as former incels to see what worked to de-radicalize them, what helped, and also to maybe find some credible peer role models that we could champion for current incels.
And can I ask you, is incel culture always violent? Are there some parts of the culture that don't glorify violence or extreme misogyny?
There's many things to say about this. So I also have a perspective as someone who works quite closely with incels from a clinical perspective. I see a lot of clients in my clinical work. There are a lot of people within the incel community who are quite far away from that violent edge. They have the misogynistic views, so they are still harmful towards women and they still perpetuate those views. But if we're talking about that turning into physical acts of violence, like we see sometimes, a lot of these individuals are people who have very poor social skills. They're very socially reserved. They have very poor social networks around them. Predominantly, they direct that sort of hatred inwards at themselves. It's a far smaller proportion that seems to then direct that predominantly outward at others. And this is somewhat echoed in the report that we produced, because we were kind of restricted in what questions we could ask in terms of violence. So the question that we did ask was if someone was committing an act of violence against a member of the incel community, to what extent is being violent okay to defend them? And we asked people sort of often, some of the time, never. And we found about 5% of people came back and said often, and about 25% either sometimes or often. So straight away we have 3/4 who aren't near that edge in terms of their perspective on the application of violence. There's a much smaller subsection who are like, yeah, often. And actually when we break it down and look at the characteristics of those who are saying often, we find a familiar package of traits around them in terms of the dark personality traits that they have, in terms of their right-wing political leanings.
I think there's two important things to say. The first, there should be a huge disclaimer about any survey data that talks about proclivity to violence. For both practical and ethical reasons, it's basically not possible to ask someone if they intend to commit violence. No university ethics board would ever sanction something like that.
So in that case, do you think there's kind of moral panic around this?
Would you mind if I finish my train of thought? Because I think that would be quite instructive as to... We can't ask that. So the best we can use is a proxy variable, like talking about the justification of violence. But in different ways, that will both over and underestimate the right thing. So, for example, what us social scientists would call social desirability bias. People like to answer questions in accordance with social norms and things like that. And then on the other side, you've got something called the behaviour intention gap, which crudely summarised is talk is cheap. It's very easy to answer something in a survey. Whether you're actually going to do it is another thing. Mm-hmm. So really, really difficult to kind of get into and understand what that true proclivity to violence is. So I always, whenever I talk about this, try and say this is not kind of a really good proxy for kind of radicalisation or anything like that, because we don't know actually how it would pertain in the real world. I think the other thing I would say is when we think about incels, there's a temptation to think about it from a terrorist perspective. Like, I'm a researcher of terrorism, those big mass casualty incel attacks, of which there is, depending on how you count, less than half a dozen, maybe a little bit more if you use a slightly different metric of counting, which is really, really low. So in that sense, one might come away concluding that there is something of a moral panic there. On the other hand, I think it's also really important to say that it's not the only type of harm that comes from this. Mm-hmm. There can be a real big emphasis on thinking about the big casualty attacks and things like that. But clearly we can see from that community there are things like kind of what we might describe as online harms. There's things like harassment online. There's doxing of people. There's things like that. Posting misogynistic things online and things like that. And they are not as headline grabbing as big terrorist attacks, but there are still harms that exist. So in some ways there is a bit of a moral panic, but in other ways I think there's kind of a justifiable concern there.
Yeah, I would just add to that from the terrorism studies perspective as well. There doesn't seem to be a largely agreed upon end goal and the collective action that incels as a group should mobilise towards. So in that sense they're a little bit different from other extremist groups and other terrorist groups. But by the same token, the individual profile of a sexless young man who's very disgruntled with society, who kind of feels purposelessness in his life, that is the kind of the prime target for radicalisation for all sorts of radical groups. So the threat is we would say, from the individual lone actor who kind of gives up on society, gives up on his own life, and is a threat to himself and also others who may harm others in his own suicide. The high-profile attacks have fit that kind of profile too.
And in that instance, is there a genuine risk to women's safety?
Women and broader society in those attacks. So it's in everyone's interest to kind of help this generation of young men to re-engage with society, because, as my colleague Joe said, it's an opportunity cost of a significant minority of young men engaging with these attitudes. They live their lives alongside women and alongside everyone, so it's important to re-engage them with society.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a real temptation to focus very heavily on incels, but again, with my terrorism researcher hat on, misogyny, in particular violent misogyny, is something that undercuts pretty much every extremist and terrorist movement that exists out there. So sometimes there's, kind of a very strong hyper-focus on one aspect of the issue could cause people to overlook that, in reality, misogyny undercuts pretty much every type of extremism.
I was just going to, I suppose, to summarise and answer your question, it depends what is panicking about. And if the panicking is about the harm that is caused by perpetuating misogynistic beliefs, then I feel that's somewhat justified. If you were to take an incel from the bag of total incels and say what danger is this person going to pose, most likely it's a threat first and foremost to the self. That's what the statistics show us in terms of self-harm, and then also to the other in terms of perpetuating that misogynistic worldview. I have met, it's becoming a bit of a pattern now in the incels that I see in private practice, they will say things like, if I was to see a woman come to harm in the street, if they were to be attacked, what I would do is I would turn away. So I would become passive and not intervene. So it's a very different relationship to the harm of women rather than saying I want to actively go and harm.
Yeah, thank you. Bill.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all of you on the panel. In trying to identify who an incel might be, would you be able to describe what kind of demographic they might be in terms of ethnicity, age, education, perhaps class? I'll ask that to all of you.
Well, we could start by telling you what the stereotype is first and foremost, because this is one angle of our research that's kind of challenging stereotypes a bit. So historically, incels have been thought to have been young, right-wing, neat, so not in education, training, employment, and white, and that has been the stereotype. And it's not uncommon, especially if you watch the American media, to see that stereotype being perpetuated. What we did with our primary research is we were actually able to go to these individuals, both in the US and in the UK, and look for differences, and say, well, to what extent is that true? Will, I don't know whether you'd be best placed to pick that up. Because
counterintuitively, we found that there was actually a disproportionate people of colour among the incel community in our data and in others as well. So in our latest data, which is an exclusively US and UK sample, 42% of participants identified as a person of colour, which is an overrepresentation. In terms of the other kind of demographic profile, yes, very disengaged from employment and training. We find extraordinarily high rates of autism among incels. So previous research has found that 18% of incels self-reported having an autism diagnosis. In our latest study, we used a measure called the AQ10, which is a clinical measure used to diagnose autism. And by this measure, anyone who scores 6 out of 10 or above, 80% of people who score 6 out of 10 or above go on to get an autism diagnosis. Using this measure, 30% of our incel sample would meet that diagnostic criteria, which is extraordinarily high considering the baseline rate for men in the population of autism is 1%. So it's extraordinarily high. And I just want to be very clear that I'm not saying that men with autism are uniquely violent or at risk of violence. There's data to suggest that they're no more violent than the general population. But we do see that young men with autism may be particularly vulnerable to the incel ideology, and when captured by that ideology may have a propensity for violence due to that kind of rigid black and white thinking that we see.
As well as the online space being one. I mean, take away any kind of extreme attitudes or anything. Autistic people very often talk about the online space being one, which is slightly sometimes a bit easier for them to navigate, kind of pick their own rules of socialization and interaction and things like that. So when we're talking about a very online community like incels, well, like, again, several types of online community, you might expect an overrepresentation of people with autism as well.
Yeah, and it's a forum where they may feel accepted for the first time, where they feel perhaps bullied by wider society. in the incel community, there's a rewarding of a very hyper-focus on a niche topic of knowledge that young men with autism might appreciate, and that those are kind of some of the reasons why young men with autism might be drawn to the community. And it gives them a kind of a clear black and white blueprint of why they're struggling in romantic relationships, an explanation for their struggles.
And just to extrapolate on that a little bit, again, thinking about extremism, violent extremism more broadly, very often the kind of dynamic you'll see is you've got kind of what you might call an in-group, so you've got the people who you identify with, and then you've got an out-group who is largely causing whatever struggles that your current in-group is facing, and then the usual solution for the extreme group or movement is violence is then the solution against the out-group because they are causing this level of suffering for us, or hatred, or something along those lines. And again, that kind of black and white thinking is something which you might see more often within people who have autism. But again, which we'll sort of touched on this a second ago, but really want to make it clear that it's not an excuse in any kind of way. We don't need to hand wave away, nor do we mean to stigmatise people with autism, but we've kind of got to be truthful to the findings of our research.
Mm-hmm. Just to come back to the demographics,
yes.
Then, in addition to the high rates of autism, what we actually find is that there's a mixed bag of ages, although on average they are to the younger side, but more around 25 than you would say 18, 19. You've got a large proportion who are non-white. Only 18%, so less than 1 in 5, would carry that neat label of not having a job and not being in education. We even find some evidence that they've got a big mixed bag of political opinions, which, if you dumb it down by taking an average, is actually slightly left-leaning rather. So a lot of the research that we're doing is kind of challenging some of the stereotypes and giving us a clearer picture on who these young men are, and there's a lot of variety there.
Importantly, just to add on the political views, so originally in our original data, we found that incels on average identified as slightly left of centre. In our latest data, we used something called the Pew Ideological Consistency Scale to measure actual political beliefs, and again, on average, they scored slightly left of centre, but importantly, those who were more right-wing were more likely to endorse violence. Which fits with the broader extremism literature that right-wing radicals are more likely to be violent than left-wing radicals.
Just thinking of the stereotype and how the research is now not correlating with the original stereotype, if that makes sense. Is there any particular reason why, I suppose, in some ways the stereotype became the stereotype and people weren't observing different groups behaving in the same way? Was it just that there was a lack of research into it, or was it just that particular stereotype of a person was the one committing the high-profile crimes, or I'm asking you actually, you answer.
Yeah, I think if you think about the really high-profile attacks, they're typically white men and younger white men. Again, high prevalence of autism within those white young men as well, and it was particularly after 2018 where you had two of those high-profile attacks in the same year. Then all of a sudden you start to get a lot of news stories, a lot of documentaries and things like that, and they all sold that idea of kind of the, in Western countries, white person sitting in their bedroom, unable to have any dating success and kind of slowly radicalising and things like that. And it's not that there's no truth to that, but I think particularly as it comes to things like race and ethnicity, we do see quite a lot of diversity as well.
Yeah, and there could be a tendency to lump a lot of problematic young male groups all into one, and one problematic group of young men is far right. And we see this as well with the tendency to lump incels in with the broader manosphere just as a general all one thing, whereas actually there's very distinct differences between them in kind.
Did you have anything to add?
No.
Okay. I know that researchers also found a correlation between NEETs, people not in education, employment or training, and people identifying as incels. Would you be able to explain, I suppose, what the research is saying about that and why you think that might be?
Yeah, I think the issue is with the term NEET. So the assumption with NEET that comes along with NEET is that one has no money and no status. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, depending on the job that you're in the education that you have, that can also not be considered very prestigious and lead to well-paying jobs and such. So in our sample, although we had quite a few participants who were in full-time education, students don't necessarily consider themselves to be very pound rich and very flush. And so if the real root here is feeling like one, it doesn't have any element of status or prestige, then NEAT doesn't necessarily capture all of the people who have those feelings about themselves.
Also, to add to that, from the broader literature, we know that two of the biggest predictors of male suicidal ideation are, number one, failure in heterosexual mating, and number two, feeling like you're a burden to your kin. Now, both of those factors are very salient for incels, who obviously struggle in their sexual and romantic goals, and also are likely to live with their parents into adulthood and be NEAT. So that would constitute both of those risk factors for suicidal ideation.
I think that.
Thank you very much. I know you talked about looking at this profile demographic over in the US, but is this profile consistent, I would say, across other comparable countries, perhaps across Europe?
In our latest data, we had a sample of US and UK, and we found very few cross-cultural differences between those two samples. I think my intuition is that the incel subculture almost constitutes a culture in and of itself. So given that it's so online, I think people who gravitate towards it are engaging in a type of culture in and of itself that I don't think is likely to vary from country to country so much. But there's interesting data from other researchers who found that you can actually predict geographic areas of high online incel activity using three variables that are kind of linked to what we describe as the local mating ecology. So the three predicting variables are high income inequality overall, low gender pay gaps, which might indicate that women don't feel as much social pressure to settle with men out of economic necessity, and finally just male biased sex ratios, where there are fewer single women in the ecology anyway, just on a sheer numbers basis. So it's interesting that you can predict areas where incels are likely to arise.
Those are very, very specific. Sorry, I'll come to you. I just wanted to ask, are there any countries that ideally fit that profile?
The country that was used to make those predictions was the US. But yeah, we could look to countries of high income inequality as a risk factor kind of area, perhaps, yeah.
That was just the point I was going to make. So that study was within the US, so you could look at it state by state, where you had the amount of variation. And the fact that you do get quite a bit of variation within the US, there's no reason why we wouldn't see that outside. Anecdotally, we have met incels from lots of different countries in Europe, where it may take on a different flavour, maybe countries like Japan, where there seems to be some element of young men socially withdrawing from society. So it's like Incel, but of a different flavour. They're not the same forum users, not sharing the same ideology. So it's almost like you have the phenomenon that happens to young men who feel like they're excluded from relationships, and then you have the ideology that comes with it separately. And I believe that ideology is more prevalent within Europe than in Asia, for example.
Yeah, so that Japanese phenomenon is called the hikikimori, and you could look to Japan as almost a canary in the coal mine direction of travel for what young men might increasingly retreat from society, because given that incel rhetoric is so hypersexual and vulgarly sexual in its nature, there's a tendency to fixate on the sexual issue. However, you could conceptualize incels as just a broader retreat from society more generally. And they lack friendships, they are just disengaged more broadly.
Thank you very much. Andrew, I wanted to ask if you could explain a bit more about the role of thinking errors in incel culture.
Yeah, so thinking errors, we would call them in CBT practice cognitive distortions. So they are ways of thinking, thoughts that we have that are distorted. So examples of thinking errors we might see in the therapy space would be black and white thinking. So seeing situations, seeing people as all or nothing with nothing in between, or catastrophizing, for example, so always thinking that the worst possible outcome is going to happen. And psychotherapists are used to dealing with these types of thinking errors because they come hand in hand with things like depression and anxiety. And a lot of time with something like CBT, it's really the thinking errors that you're addressing that then helps with the emotions and helps with the mental health afterwards. Now, if you look at incel rhetoric online, it's riddled with cognitive distortions or thinking errors. So there's a lot of black and white thinking, there's a lot of labeling, there's a lot of catastrophizing, so things are bad for me now and they're never going to get any better. Those tend to be a sort of general thinking errors. Our research has also shown some specific ones. So there's a paper that Will and I did where we showed that incels overestimate and underestimate different mate preferences that women have. And so they do that with enough consistency that you can see the differences as a group compared to other men. You can see that coming through. So believing that women put more of an emphasis on physical attractiveness in a mate than kindness, for example. And so that might be an example of a very specific thinking error about a very certain thing. But in general, we see these things that would not be unfamiliar to someone working within the therapy space and is intimately connected with poor mental health.
What I would add to that is it might be informative to think incels score very highly on a personality trait of victimhood, which is comprised of 4 different measures. So one is a significant need for recognition, this preoccupation with having the legitimacy of their grievance acknowledged. It actually is more aggravating for people to say to incels, oh, you could actually get a girlfriend if you tried a little bit harder, or it's not all hopeless for you. They actually prefer information that verifies their negative self-view. The second dimension of the trait victimhood is moral elitism, so the belief that an individual or their in-group behaves more morally than others, and you might see this in incels in that they consider female mate preferences as quite superficial and they sneer at it, whereas they might consider themselves as having loftier preferences. Third is a lack of empathy, which manifests in incels in the way of nobody cares about my pain, why should I care about anyone else's? That's a big theme you see in incel rhetoric. And finally, the dimension of rumination. So this preoccupation with reflecting on perceived instances of being slighted, and it fits with this self-verification that they're seeking information from the world that verifies their worldview, that society hates them. And this explains why incels engage in what I describe as performative antagonism. So they say whatever they can to annoy people, engineers criticism, which they then use to fuel their worldview that society has given up on them. So that might actually be informative in terms of therapeutic interventions, is proving them wrong is very important, giving them evidence that we don't want to exclude them from society.
Is there anything else sorry.
I was just going to say that's one of the key things that sustains thinking errors and cognitive distortions is having confirmation bias. And so the incel community is very good at generating content that feeds into and confirms their beliefs. And so that perpetuates and worsens and sustains the thinking errors that they have. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything we can do to challenge these thinking errors, I don't know, either therapeutically or from education earlier on?
So this is one of the reasons why we take multiple angles in our research. So our research is saying that there's opportunities to intervene from an ideological perspective, from a networking perspective, and a mental health perspective. Now, from a mental health perspective, sometimes people misunderstand mental health support. They think you're sitting opposite someone who just says they're there and agrees with whatever you say. But real, proper mental health support is actually about having a strong therapeutic relationship that leads to challenging of one's beliefs. And actually, if you wanted to get a gold standard intervention that's going to lead to someone changing harmful and faulty beliefs, it would actually be the types of interventions we use in mental health work. So in CBT being a prime example of that. So this is one of the reasons, and there's whole families of interventions that come under that mental health label. There's also behavioural stuff with regards to social skill development. Maybe we'll come on to this a little bit later on, but there's this perspective of what do you do with an incel now who is at risk of causing harm. and what do we do much further upstream to when men aren't incel before they get to that point to intervene. And they definitely lend themselves to different types of intervention, I would say.
When we think about counter-extremism interventions as well, there's really, really not a lot of evidence that they are doing anything productive. I think that's really important to state. We've got about 20-ish years, since about the start of the War on Terror, of people trying to think about what are sometimes called soft interventions, so non-military, non-police interventions, trying to win hearts and minds, trying to dissuade people out of extremist ideology. And it would be fair to say that with a few exceptions, there's very, very little evidence that anything is doing anything productive there. And even in some instances, some evidence that a challenge of someone's ideology may cause them to dig deeper into their existing ideology and things like that as well. So you kind of get this problem that you can look at adjacent fields like clinical practice and things like that, which there's a long history of success and helping people. But when we're thinking about extremism, that's something which is large enough that it becomes very, very difficult to scale something as expensive as one-on-one therapy and things like that. Whereas this idea of, a counter-narrative or a fact-check or a challenger in that respect, there's really not any evidence that it works. You kind of end up within a rock and a hard place, that you can't scale the things that you have some confidence in, and then the things that you can afford to do, don't really know if they work.
Another challenge is actually getting incels to have any buy-in towards re-engaging with mental health interventions. They invariably tell us in our qualitative interviews that they've tried to get mental health support and have had very negative experiences with it. So I think what would be necessary would be to reverse engineer the process and actually work with clinicians to design a bespoke style of therapy that they may re-engage with. Because the number one predictor of any therapeutic alliance relationship working or therapeutic intervention working is the strength of that relationship and the therapist being seen as a credible kind of actor who really understands their issue. So maybe working with clinicians to help them understand the incel mindset might be informative. Also, again, the need is for the longitudinal data to track the long-term trajectories of incels, perhaps research the incel exit, individuals who've actually exited to see what worked for them. But yeah, it requires further research for sure to see what interventions have efficacy.
And then, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say some of our qualitative work has been specifically focusing on incels path down into inceldom, but also how they've engaged with mental health services. And we've had individuals who have seen 12 therapists, and each time that's broken down for it's almost a list of don't do this if you want to keep an incel engaged in the process. So we are working on that. A strong therapeutic alliance, I think, is very important. The other thing to bear in mind is when it comes to therapy, sometimes clients want to work with certain types of people. You'll see this in, say, substance misuse, alcoholism. A lot of the time some alcoholics will only work with people who've been through that journey themselves. And so there's possibly a discussion to be had there about being sensitive to that issue as well, particularly because, as we show in the report, incels see their enemy as feminists, and actually there's this growing trend, particularly in the US, for therapists to kind of show their hand for their philosophical position. And we've had several incels who have said, it turned out that my therapist was a feminist. I don't agree with that. They can't possibly understand what my position, so I'm out of here. When in reality, that was a competent mental health professional who probably could have done a lot of good work. So there's something there about how the therapy is administered and by whom once it's set up and established.
And interestingly, just to add, from the qualitative interviews that we've done, incels, I often ask the question in each interview, how would you know you're no longer an incel? What would have to change? Get one girlfriend, have sex one time, what would need to change? And invariably they describe it like alcoholism, that you could have a relapse. So it really is this way of thinking, this worldview, rather than even a particular predicament.
So, and just briefly, in terms of actually challenging the thinking errors, at what point do you find, or what point has research shown that you found that those who go on to into inceldom actually start to adopt these views? And I suppose, other than mainly the online space, is there anything else that kind of predicts this? I suppose it's a way to kind of identify when the best intervention might be, because it sounds like what's happening afterwards is not working as well.
Yeah. So, unless my colleagues correct me, we don't know, because there isn't decent longitudinal research. What I can tell you is from some of the cross-sectional research, we're starting to build a bit of a picture. So Speckhardt et al. Did a very interesting study recently where they showed that you can find clusters of incels within the community. Most of them fall into this category where they still have a little bit of hope that things might change for them and they don't have as extreme misogynistic views. Then you have a smaller group of people who are what they called internalizers. They're really giving themselves a hard time, high risk of self-harm, but also have the real strong misogynistic views. And then you have a smaller group still who they called externalizers, where it's really festered and is now being directed outwards. And when you put these side by side, they almost feel like a funnel, like a direction that people are going in, that they're arriving into the community still with a bit of hope. Then over time turning it inwards and then finally turning it outwards. But we don't know this for certain. But it would make sense in light of what we see. And so that leads us to believe that individuals aren't arriving at those communities complete blank slates with no concept of the ideology. There's enough ideology out there on social media and anonymous forums that anyone can just nip into. You can see this sort of stuff on Facebook, for example, that just comes up on your feed. So I think by the time someone gets to the point where they've joined a community, they're already very much aware of incel ideology and maybe buy into it a little bit, which might explain in the research why we found a slightly weaker influence of networking, which is the degree to which people are really getting stuck into communities, because they may already be at the point where they've kind of bought into the ideology, and so further networking with people isn't really having more of an effect on them.
I think what might be informative, though, is encouraging incels to cultivate actual social relationships offline. So if they're learning about dating dynamics from very toxic online platforms only and lack real-world social relationships to challenge that learning, they're going to go with that. So that could be potentially an intervention, is cultivate role models that cracks that certainty of their black pill belief. And once a little bit of a crack in that certainty is present, that could be hopeful.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Kirsten.
Thank you, Chair. That brings me nicely on to the question that I'd like to ask you about networking. The research that's been done has found that poor mental health and adoption of incel ideology was significantly more likely to predict the development of harmful views than social networking. So, developing on what you've already said, what more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the first caveat to say there is that we're not saying that networking doesn't have an influence. So all of the pathways that all of the variables that we found in our analysis all have their own impact on incel propensity for harm. But what we're just finding is that impact is stronger for poor mental health, which I always give a layman summary of: if I don't care about myself, then I'm less likely to care about other people. That's how we see that as a contributor to harm. And then also the ideology itself. I think the real interesting thing and why networking in our discussion is maybe not dwelled upon as much as we could is we've also found that really interesting bi-directional relationship between mental health and ideology. They wind each other up. The more I am agreeing with the ideology, the worse my mental health gets. The worse my mental health is, the more susceptible I am to the ideology. And I think that's really important, because what that's telling us, it's notoriously hard to change ideological beliefs, particularly if your intention is to just tell someone to stop having them. People tend to hold on to their beliefs quite dearly, whereas mental health support generally is very good at, over a prolonged period, building a relationship with someone until you trust them and you listen to them and you're willing to have your beliefs challenged and changed that way. And so the fact that relationship sprung out, and the fact that bidirectional relationship sprung out, and the fact that gives us maybe a way of thinking about intervention that hasn't been considered before, is maybe why in the report networking isn't discussed at length. But there is a lot to say about networking.
I think it tells us something quite interesting about our responses to it as well. Clearly, when we think about extremism, things like misogyny, hate speech and things like that, the movement over the last 10 or so years has been to try and remove as much of it from the internet as possible. Now, we can make the case that it's simply existing online is problematic and harmful, and I think there's a really good argument for that. But no one should be under the illusion that if you break up the networking, that this is going to stop. Mm-hmm. It's not. This is something, again, our research shows there's several different ways in, there's several different other really important factors that take place. So despite the fact that a few answers ago I said, oh, well, we need to understand that the history of these kind of counter-extremism interventions isn't very good, unfortunately, also, just removing it from the internet is not going to stop it at all. There is no reason to believe that is the case. It's going to have to be a multi-pronged approach.
And in fact, incels might perceive such attempts of shutting down their forums as further evidence that society doesn't want them to even talk and feel further discluded from society.
Indeed, thank you. In incel forums, a premium is put on saying outrageous things because these posts get the most attention, they provoke the most discussion. To what extent do you think that pushes an individual into genuinely adopting extremist views? Don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah.
Well, I think there is new research to show that social media companies in general reward more extreme content that is outrageous and engineers outrage in the viewers. So that's problematic, perhaps. In terms of the actual how it leads to whether that content being amplified leads to greater adoption of those beliefs, I don't know of any research on that, but it intuitively seems like it could be the case.
Before we go on, can I just ask you to clarify that point about social media companies rewarding the most extreme content? And I tend to very much agree with that, just in a very unscientific way. But yeah. I'm wondering about the the issue of algorithms. Are there algorithms that manipulate that into being a reality? So
my research, when it's not incels, is on social media algorithms as well. So I'm just in the process of, with my team, completing a meta review on about 50 studies looking at exactly that problem. We looked at all online harms, so we looked at extremism, hate speech, kind of mis and disinformation. Where we could find the studies, child sexual exploitation, although they're few and far between, and then body image issues. And basically what we found was, as it pertains to not illegal content. There's very little evidence to suggest that illegal content is being amplified, because for the most part in 2024, social media companies are pretty decent, not perfect, at getting rid of it. But when it comes to what we might call legal but harmful, I think you know it when you see it, even if it's difficult to define, there's absolutely evidence. So it's sort of stuff, and there's a couple that focus specifically on incels, saying that it's very easy if you start to engage with incel content on YouTube or another platform, that you're only, all of a sudden, that you're a few clicks away or a few next up videos away before all of a sudden that's all that appears in your feeds. So there is certainly something there from about the 50 or so studies that we could find from the last 5 years.
Incels are very much aware that other incels say these antagonistic things as a sort of cathartic release. So in that sense, they probably do a better job at convincing outside observers that that's what incels believe rather than incels themselves. That being said, you can't be around extreme views for prolonged periods of time without that echo chamber effect edging people upwards into, you've said that really extreme thing, and I know that you're just kidding about that, but you've said that somewhat extreme thing, maybe you were serious about that one. So
there's more that tech companies should be doing to protect people who are potentially vulnerable from some of this material.
So
go on, Joe.
Clearly, yes. There's been, obviously, but the problem that you have specifically with incels is that they are not congregating for the most part on what if we're using Digital Services Act, very large online platforms, it's not so easy. I forget how the Online Safety Act refers to it. Just large online platforms. I think 7 million users in the UK, is it? Then Incel's not really got a huge presence there. Incel's more populating the kind of fringe, their own bespoke websites, like Incel-specific ones, sometimes subreddits, although it doesn't usually take them too long to get booted from subreddits, and then Discord as well. So they should be doing more, but for the most part, these are platforms that exist outside of the usual regulatory scope. And the Chan boards are as well another very important one too. And I think going back to that question of recommendation algorithms, most of those platforms don't have recommendation algorithms. So while there is certainly something there when it comes to amplification of bad content, a big part of it as well is the sorts of people that are inhabiting it. And usually a problem arises when those two things meet each other. But as is the case of these forums, you can be perfectly toxic without the help of any recommendation algorithms.
Do you think that there is any evidence showing that extreme incel content filters down into other parts of the internet? I hear what you're saying about sort of these very specific parts, but it obviously does stretch to some extent beyond that. Does that filter down and then radicalise men who wouldn't describe themselves as incels, maybe following on from what Andrew said?
You have what I've come to call incel-adjacent men who share some of the beliefs, they're much more numerous, but are aware of the communities, but wouldn't necessarily define themselves by that label. So I think it does spread outside, especially because incels use memes a lot, and memes, by their definition, spread quite readily. The other thing that happens, though, is as these things enter into the public consciousness, they tend to get twisted and distorted from their original sort of intention as well. So at the moment, even the term incel itself, people will use that as just a generic derogatory term aimed at men. So you have seen examples online where women are calling men an incel because they are a man who's in a relationship who's done a bad thing. So it's actually, they're using a label that is so far away from the definition, that person is so far away from being an incel that the label doesn't really fit. So it kind of does push into the public consciousness, but it kind of gets distorted a little bit on the way as well.
Going back to the question right at the start about that distinction between the red pill and the black pill, while incels might typically inhabit kind of those deepest, darkest corners of the internet, red pill stuff is clearly on these platforms a lot. And as we mentioned at the start, they're not the same. There are quite distinct differences, but there is also overlap as well. So influencers that shall not be named, etc., they are clearly permeating on the biggest social media platforms and are right there.
Yeah, just a parenthetical thought to that is going back to contextualising the risk of threat. Yes, sexless young men constitute some risk, but nowhere near as dangerous to women as jealous boyfriends or insecure boyfriends who are very cost-inflicting to their partners. That's a far greater source of harm to women.
And looking at other groups who may be affected, what extent do you think, or to what extent do you think that the filtering down of incel culture is impacting on children and young people now?
So I talked briefly about this earlier in terms of this pipeline pathway to inceldom. And one thing when you start getting into the nitty-gritty of incels one-on-one and talking to them is that you find a very similar story each time, which is that their perception of rejection starts very early on. Before it was within the context of heterosexual relationships and with women, it's in high school and it's from other children, both boys and girls. And so the rejection starts there, and the resentment towards normal people who can socialise when I can't starts at that point. And so for me, that it's a very fruitful avenue for intervention. But the reason I'm bringing this up in relation to your question is because it's at that point where people are potentially more susceptible. I'm starting to get these negative feelings about myself, about others, about my capacity to relate to others. And some of these memes, some of the cultural outputs from these communities really speak to individuals who are in that position. And so earlier on, there's probably that vulnerability to those ideas right back in high school. A lot of incels, incidentally, they miss high school. They lament over high school because they say that is the period where people learn all of these social skills. They have a relationship that lasts a day, and they do all the silly things to learn how to socialise. And all of them say, I missed out on that opportunity. I had no friends, or I was working really, really hard, and I didn't get to do that. And now I'm in the outside world, and things are real. I have no hope of developing and honing those skills.
But it is important to acknowledge what factors make being a member of the incel community attractive to them. So they actually take a lot of positives out of it. They get a common enemy, they get a fraternity with their fellow incels, they get a rich lexicon of trolling language that they get great chagrin out of, especially when they see that filtering out into wider society. Interestingly, incels, in terms of their culture, have an outsized kind of influence on mainstream language. A lot of their terminology eventually gets mainstreamed, like being blackpilling or being blackpilled is kind of filtering into contemporary language on the internet. So it's important to acknowledge what are the appealing aspects of being an incel that make it reluctant for them to let go of it. So they're basically trading a position, competing in a mating market that they see as an anxiety-inducing and not very rewarding, for all these positives that come with the incel identity.
I think given what we've said about the availability of, at very least, incel-adjacent content on social media, I think it should certainly, given everything that Andrew and William have just said, should raise an alarm as to the current kind of content that is available officially if you're 13, but I'm sure, as everyone will know, it's much easier to get on social media if you're younger than 13 as well. And it's exactly as Andrew says, your brain is still forming. You're still trying to work out how to socialise, and you're trying to form your understanding of the world and things like that. And that vast amount of content that is very easy to find online is particularly problematic. So obviously, one of the things that the Online Safety Act is trying to curb. The proof will be in the pudding, I guess.
I guess the final thing to say, just off the back of both of those, is one of the things that community offers is a very simplistic view of the world that then means that you don't have to go through the very taxing thing of trying to understand a very grey world that's full of inconsistencies. And that might be one of the reasons why neurodivergent individuals who are maybe on the autistic spectrum are more drawn towards that, because it's quite a comforting thing to be able to categorise and form your world by a smaller number of very easy sort of decisions and perspectives than to appreciate it for the complex whirlwind that it really is.
And if there's an absence of alternative kind of influencers of helping young men understand how to navigate a complex dating market, they will turn to pickup artists, they will turn to red pill content creators. So perhaps that could pave the way for some interventions as well. The dating market, I always describe, it's a ruthless contest that you're kind of thrown into when you become a teenager. You get no real preparation for it, and you have to kind of learn your way through it through trial and error. That's not very comfortable for anyone in it. So perhaps we could do better in terms of education initiatives to help people prepare for the dating market.
Thank you for that.
So one last very quick point. I'm terribly sorry. I think one of the issues as well is if you think about changes that have happened over the past few decades, I think there's now becoming a dearth of spaces for young men to learn how to socialise and be young men. So if you think about traditional organisations like Scouts, for example, where you would have access to a positive role model of masculinity, engaging in positive tasks and learning how to socialise with your peers, I feel like, particularly post-COVID as well, these sorts of opportunities are dying off. And so individuals are learning how to socialise online through a screen in a very different way. And then they look to maybe those sort of male role models in places that maybe they shouldn't.
Thank you very much for that. I've got a couple of further questions, but on a very different topic. So maybe developing on your red pill, black pill conversations. To what extent do you think incel violence, either imagined or actual violence, is always directed at women?
In the high-profile attacks, there's one that stands out as specifically targeting women only. That's the Tallahassee yoga instructor, yoga studio killing. The others have been just a more lashing out at society more broadly. But the misogyny is targeted very much directed towards women. The incels perceive women as living life on easy mode, and they resent them the most. But there is an argument to say that they also direct aggression in their online content towards just normies in society and blue-pilled people more broadly. But the misogyny certainly is a unique harm to women.
Just to jump on that, it's worth. We asked our sample of incels who they considered the biggest enemy to incels, and the top two answers were feminists and feminists and the political left. But other answers, well over kind of half of the way up, were wider society and things like and men in general. Yeah. So there's clearly a lot of anger going in a lot of different directions, but it's also fair to say that clearly the rhetoric is very primarily not just women, but also specific types of women, feminists and things like that.
There's also strong associations between some of the incel forums and assisted suicide forums as well. So if we're talking about physical acts of violence, well, that could be directed at the self, which of course a lot of people don't necessarily realise that could potentially harm women as well, because behind every incel is a mother and potentially a sister and a grandmother and an auntie and a cousin. So there's there's a family or a network around that individual who could be harmed by them harming themselves.
And is there a greater risk of suicide among incels than there is of them causing harm to other people, do you think?
So with incels, in the sample that we had, 1 in 5 were saying that they had daily thoughts of self-harm in the last 2 weeks. Now you can compare that in 2014 in the Adult Psychiatry Morbidity Survey. You found in the general population that was 5% of people who had a suicidal thought in the past year. So there's a real high case of self-harm. If you take away the daily thing and you just have how many incels have thought about self-harm in the last week, that rises to about 80%. So that's quite rife within that community compared to the general population.
Why is that the case? Why might suicide look attractive, particularly to...
It's the hopelessness. So the key characteristic of the black pill is that one gives up on things ever becoming any better. So I'm in a position that I hate and nothing is going to change and there's nothing that I can do about it. And so for some people, the intense negative emotions associated with that interpretation then leads them to think about, well, would I prefer to not live rather than have these thoughts and feelings that I currently do?
There's also strong comorbidity between the depression, the anxiety, and the autism with suicidal ideation too. And as I mentioned earlier, the two biggest risk factors for suicidal ideation in men is the failing in mating goals and the burdensomeness to kin. So both really salient for incels.
And then one final problematic piece to this puzzle is that there is a culture of talking about suicide in a meaningful way as well. So if you just go on the forum, you'll likely see them sometimes talk in depth about their struggles with mental health and suicide attempts and things like that, and sometimes telling each other to go and do it in a very horrible... So, studies on suicide have pretty reliably predicted that the more that talk of suicide goes on, the more likely people are to actually act on it as well. So when you've got all of these problems combined with a community that is happy to talk about it and happy to go into depth about it, it becomes a thing that can really blossom.
One thing that's not captured in the report, I've actually been subjected to social media abuse from organisations that protest the assisted suicide forums. So we get pushback on our incel research from organisations that take exception to the assisted suicide forums because of the link between the assisted suicide forums and the incel forums.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just ask you, I'm interested to know, when incels are receiving CBT or similar kind of help, if you like, how do they normally end up there? Do they get referred due to particular behaviours or do they self-refer?
Can I just, because I know you've got the statistics about referrals and stuff. So I would say generally they're not, first of all, that they're not it's not happening at such frequency that incels are reaching out and saying, I want help with these beliefs, that we can say that this is happening. Certainly not enough to derive any sort of meaning for what that looks like in the room and stuff like that. We have some statistics on prevent referrals. The one thing that is quite interesting, and one of the things that really explains why we should be doing this maybe within the confines of, say, a CBT intervention, is incels have a very interesting relationship with evidence, right? So when you do CBT normally, the idea is that people have beliefs, but they don't really have evidence behind those beliefs. And when you start challenging that, people realize that their beliefs are not grounded in evidence, and so they change their beliefs. Incels actually consider themselves to be sort of research informed. So there's one Wikipedia page, incels.wiki, that has one page of called Black Pill Science, that has almost 200 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles referenced on there, with discourse accompanying each, justifying and using that piece of evidence to support their beliefs. So these individuals, when they come in with their beliefs, they're very crystallized because they think they've got the evidence on their side. So actually, even if you can get them into the therapy space and start working, that would be very tricky, because you're going to have to, you can't introduce this idea of, well, let's look at the evidence, because a generalist sort of practitioner who works with all sorts of issues will kind of be bombarded with counter evidence that supports those beliefs. So that's just something I wanted to say there, and kind of acknowledging that we probably do need to take a specialist look at this and do some specialist training for practitioners who are going to work with incels. In terms of what's actually happening and access to services, I don't know, Joe, whether you wanted to...
Yeah, so I think that whenever you're talking about how incels end up getting kind of support or intervention, the elephant in the room is prevent. The Home Office has been counting incels as their own distinct group for 2 years, and they've been about 1% of total referrals. So not huge, but certainly present. That usually pertains to about 70 to 100 individuals that have been referred to prevent. Now, the problem is that certainly our research and other research talks about things like mental health issues and neurodiversity and things like that.
We are going to move on to talk about that.
Would you like me to hold up on that until you get... Okay, I'll proceed then. I
would just add to a further challenge in engaging incels in the therapeutic relationship is that strong need for recognition. Again, you're very likely to alienate an incel client if you overly challenge their worldview. They'll feel they would describe themselves as being gaslighted if you kind of cast any aspersions on the legitimacy of their difficulty. They'd actually prefer it if you acknowledged, yes, it must be actually really tough. The example I use is short men are often discriminated against in dating.
Just to be clear, that's talking more about initial stages. So a strong therapeutic relationship and over a course of therapy can withstand challenges to worldview, and that's actually how you elicit change, but it takes a while. It's not something that's a quick fix. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I suppose my thinking was, within that community, if you like, if you've got people that don't accept that they need any help or assistance in changing their views, or then where do you start, and how do you get them into that place in the first place?
Yeah, and a lot of it, if I'm honest, is what would be the point of this? This isn't going to get me access to a relationship. So part of it is actually starting that sort of, well, can this do something for you regardless of that? Can this help you cope with those negative emotions, perhaps? The ironic thing being, of course, that if they improve their mental health, they then will socialise better, and that might indirectly help with their problems.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jackie.
Thank you, Chair. Running through your evidence, all of you this afternoon, has been the comorbidity with autism and poor mental health, and you're sort of taking a helicopter view. You can see why that is, because people who are neurodivergent, society doesn't work comfortably for them, and a lot of this activity takes place in the online world, which is an easier place, as you say, for them to navigate. But it also exacerbates that, and obviously exacerbates the mental health. But of course, not all incels are suffering with autism spectrum disorder. So, to what extent are vulnerable men in this category groomed and targeted by actually what is cultish behaviour. Who goes for actually? Do you want to go first?
Yeah,
Jeff?
Again, going back to kind of extremisms more broadly, I do try and avoid the use of the word groomed, mostly because what we see, regardless of ideology, is typically people who are actively seeking and engaging with this kind of content. It doesn't mean it never happens. There are obviously some people that are so vulnerable that they are kind of manipulated in some way, which could be described using that word. But I think in the vast majority of cases, people are there of their own volition and have made active choices to get there. So I would typically personally avoid the use of that word, but yeah.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be a very sophisticated recruitment campaign from incels. Yes, they do encourage other incels to take the black pill and are very demeaning towards what they describe as cope, where people are kind of, deluding themselves into meaning in their life. They encourage that nihilism, but as regards trying to radicalise others, it's not comparable to the way other extremist groups behave in trying to recruit.
Isn't that because, we're basically talking about sex, which is a natural impulse, as opposed to a belief system in terms of things like right-wing ideology. In that sense, it's an easier cult to push because there's a biological impulse there. I don't know.
Well, I don't think you're wrong, but I still don't see that there's much evidence to suggest that there's anything that we could realistically call grooming. It is, if anything, most incels, for the most part, want to be left alone. There really is no kind of active recruitment in the sense. I researched jihadism, I researched the far right, in which they are really concerned with increasing their numbers and getting people in via more formalised recruitment. That really doesn't exist when it comes to incels, so that's typically why I would avoid using that kind of language.
And importantly, those groups, it's necessary for them to recruit because they have a clear, collectively agreed upon end goal that involves political violence. That's absent from incels as a community.
There's actual physical violence, but actually, if we're talking about misogyny, which is actually a cultural phenomenon, it doesn't play out in terms of an end goal like that. It just plays out in a continual hostile society, which actually you're sitting talking to a group of women that we're all very familiar with.
But I really, really agree with that, which is why, and I made this point a little bit earlier, is minimise the focus on incels and realise that, first of all, misogyny undercuts every single extremist movement, and also it's, to be frank, completely rife within society as well, that this small group of, a number in the tens of thousands worldwide is only a tiny, infinitesimally small piece of the wider puzzle of misogyny. And so by that, you're completely right. It is kind of an ideology and a worldview, but it's so prevalent that, inherent... Sorry.
That kind of makes my point, because, we're talking about, if we refer to influencers who we will not name and give them the credibility, actually, a vulnerable group of people who are feeling alienated from society, taking comfort from sitting online, finding a community that is giving them comfort because there's other people like them. That group of people are being used by more clever, violent misogynists to advance that ideology, are they not?
Yes, but again, really important to note the difference between influencers, red pill influencers, and incel blackers, because those red pill influencers are absolutely trying to increase their clout, or whatever you want to call it. They're absolutely trying to spread their message as far as possible. They're absolutely trying to find followers, usually for financial gain, which is something else to talk about when it comes to social media. Incels don't really fit that bill in the same way. Again, they just want to occupy a small corner of the internet. They want to post, admittedly, very toxic, bad things. But I would urge to treat the two separately, analytically.
It's the same, isn't it? Given that, if we're concerned that we're applying these people to prevent rather than giving them mental health, but it is actually the same, because if you talk about people who perpetrate, let's say, right-wing terrorist attacks that lead to murder, they are just as vulnerable as the people that we're talking about in terms of incel culture, being used by. So, I don't know.
That's right. Just two very quickly. So first of all, the way that I tend to see this is, in an ideal world, I wouldn't want someone to have to get to the point where a teacher wants to make a prevent referral about them before we intervene. So I take exception to that in as much as we shouldn't wait to administer or give mental health support via prevent, because at that point it's gone so far down the line. Why aren't we doing some stuff earlier on? The other thing that isn't captured in this report that you might find useful is that we found some provisional statistical evidence that we've got some more sort of subgroupings within the community. One over here that has that sort of neurodivergence, bullying history, see their mate value as poor, so that category kind of that you were talking about. But we also seem to have a separate category of high dark triad, dark personality traits, so psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and right-wing political views. Now, what's interesting is statistically they seem pulled apart. So you're not getting that many who are high dark triad who are also autistic. You're not getting that many who are high right-wing who are also bullied. And personally, I'm more scared about this category over here. So I wouldn't want our thinking to dwell too much on the sort of neurodivergent side without reflecting now. And one final thing I just wanted to very quickly say, because I'll kick myself for not saying it. People often say that this is about sex, but it's not about sex. We have incels that we've interviewed who have gone to see prostitutes, and it's made no difference to them whatsoever, because for them it's about feeling like they are worthy enough to be chosen for a relationship, whether that is sexual or otherwise, by someone else.
Interesting.
Yes, but it is, to the extent that it is about mating constitutes more than just sex. Like Andrew said, it's being sexually selected, which is important.
It's about social relationships, actually.
Yes.
That's what it's about, and that's why people on the spectrum are so vulnerable to this. So I think you've taken me to where I wanted to go, actually, which is this, is that, I have a very firm view that society does not work well for people with neurodivergent conditions. And I don't think we do enough to equip them with the tools to help themselves. And it's perhaps worse now than it's ever been, because as we've all said, it's really easy now to sit on your own in a room with a screen in front of you. Whereas in the old days, we used to go out and play when we were kids, and so you'd find ways of building those socials. And you alluded earlier to post-lockdown and pandemic and all those things. So, I mean, in terms of, as you've just characterised, separating the vulnerable people who are, find comfort in the incel movement, should we say, rather than are actually really ideologically unpleasant. We need to be able to separate them off, don't we? And prevent perhaps is not the tool. It's got to be about giving people the tools to not get to that space.
I mean, one thing that people forget, and again, this is kind of a side to of incel specifically now, but we say the term social skills, but a lot of the time you may as well be saying social talents to people. People neglect the fact that skill is in there, and skills need to be honed and practiced and maintained. There's some really good work by a colleague of ours, Professor Norman Lee from Singapore, showing that you can, through group settings, through training, actually improve the mating performance of non-incel men, just men who are struggling with relationships. Will might say a bit more about that, because it was training them for speed dating, right, Will?
Yes, that's right. And there was also another intervention specifically targeting young men with autism to try and improve their romantic competency, and also had some efficacy. So there is, given that we know there's such a link between perceiving yourself as low mate value and misogyny, that could be a level at which we could intervene, because those two things likely have a bidirectional effect too. That it can be kind of maybe summed up by the Jim Morrison song lyric that women seem wicked when you're unwanted. That kind of sums up the incel misogyny attitude. And it's broader literature that refers to that link between perceiving yourself as low mate value and misogyny. That applies to just men in general, not just incels. So it could be, and the bidirectional effect I refer to is that women tend to not want to date misogynists. So it has a cyclical effect whereby you perceive yourself as lower mate value, become more misogynist, get more rejection. So it's kind of breaking that cycle would be important. But So
to just be clear on that point, there's scope to help young men who are maybe neuroatypical with their social skills before they've even developed misogynistic beliefs, before they're down the path.
Childhood, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Well, before they even need to feel validated by their relationships with
exactly.
Could I add as well, Andrew, that in our data, the indirect pathway to harmful beliefs from autism was specifically when it was combined with bullying, and that reflects other data too, that individual incels with an autism diagnosis, they are most likely to report feeling violent and misogynistic when it's combined with reporting a history of bullying as well. So to echo your point about society isn't actually very helpful towards neurodivergent people, I think that comes through in our data too.
Yeah. So coming back to your comorbidities, if we reverse that, so we try and equip people with the tools to help them navigate the world. Symptomatic of those would be a house and a job. If we were able to make sure that we were giving that amount of support, how effective would that be in tackling this culture? What proportion would we...
Yeah. I would prefer to see us get people to the point where, because they're all entwined, right? So the reason that people are enabled to be able to have a good job and to have a house is in part because they're functioning as best as they can socially. So I would
still that social support, isn't it? It comes back to that every time.
So just in case, because I wasn't sure whether you were saying if we took people who were struggling with social skills and just gave them a job and a house, they'd be okay. No. But if we went a bit further up from that and sort of and built up their social skills, not just within a romantic context, but just in a social context, then of course that's going to unlock a whole host of things. And if you feel like you're thriving in society, if you feel like you're in a good place, it's easier to feel like other people are good in the world as well. I am okay and therefore you're okay.
Yeah, and improving the material conditions of young men's lives might have some impact for sure, given that we've found research that it's areas of high income inequality that really predicts where incel activity is most prevalent. So that is certainly worth thinking about.
I mean, I say this because I've just felt for a long time that people with learning disabilities and autism do not get the support early enough. And I think society needs to grip that brings with it long-term problems for wider society.
I think it's really been exacerbated in the mobile phone, social media age as well, because I think I think it was you that made the example earlier that we used to just go out and play, and neurodiverse people just kind of had to do it and kind of learn, kind of law of the jungle type thing. Now there is an option just to stay in on a device and not, be subject to that kind of algorithmically driven world. And while it may be comforting on some level to pick and choose your social interactions on your device, it's probably not beneficial to your long-term kind of thriving.
Sending it to the other end for a moment as well, incels will benefit from getting out into the real world and forming relationships that aren't necessarily romantic as well, because if you have very strong opinions about 50% of the population, i.e. women, that are very rigid and all women think this and all women act this way, well, the more you can subject them to counter examples of that by going to the supermarket and going for a drink with people after work and having normal life but it's, I've met incels who, even if they have a job, it's a job where it puts them in a position where they don't have to talk to many people. It's a remote job with a very small team of other men who are maybe also neurodivergent. So it's like, how can we put them in positions that give them counter evidence naturally to the that are fueling the beliefs that they have.
And it's a social intervention, really, isn't it? I mean, from that perspective, it feels increasingly, and we're looking at it from the perspective of incel culture now, but you could look at it from the perspective of self-harm, you could look at it from the perception of, as you say, extreme biologists, or gender ideology being another one. If we're just going to let this situation happen where people are just encouraged to sit at home in their rooms with computers, all these extreme situations are just going to thrive, aren't they? Let's be frank. And it's more. We see this over and over again with people who've got other comorbidities.
I mean, we work at universities. One of the things that was most apparent for me after COVID is the first generation of students that I had through the door couldn't make eye contact with me from a couple of years of what happened. So those skills get rusty quite quickly.
Yeah.
And I understand that the call for sort of societal level intervention, but it really does need to be the personal level.
Yes.
What are you suffering? How can we help you? How can we support you?
It doesn't help if we're leaving people within the context of their own families. And actually sometimes those families can think they're doing their loved one a favour by protecting them like that, but actually it could make that situation worse.
Mm-hmm.
Agree.
Have you got any examples of interventions that have been effective?
That's a wide open area for future research that is sorely needed. We have some speculative ideas of stuff we'd love to try. Again, the research to examine the trajectories of Incel exit forum users could be very informative. But yeah, it requires longitudinal research, more data,
Yeah.
I have some success at a personal level with my clients with CBT-grounded interventions, but nothing that we've been able to package up as a formal scientific study yet.
Yeah, I'm just trying to avoid the kind of securitized counterterrorism thing might be more likely to yield some level of success. It's difficult. There clearly is some level of national security need when we're talking about high casualty terrorist attacks every now and again. But it might be that for a lot of incels, that is exactly the wrong type of intervention that they need.
Yeah, absolutely, because it could make them more withdrawn. That's very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I believe that concludes the questions from the committee today. If you have anything further that you wish to add, please do write into the committee. Thank you for coming. Your evidence was very interesting, a little bit dark and a little bit scary, but very helpful to us. Order.
The proceeding has ended.